Now remember, I'm not here giving you my opinions. We are here to work through this. The Bible says, let us reason together. I'm showing you the documents. We're going to walk through the reason together, because I don't want anybody to walk out that door and say, Chris Ann Hall said. Wipe that from your memory banks. That is not an acceptable phrase. Because I am not here to say, I am here to teach. Reserved means to exercise dominion over a thing to the exclusion of all others. The power reserved to the states is ownership by the states, right? We know that word reserved means ownership. That means the states own that power, which means the states have the right to say no. Can France step into your state and tell you how to run your state? No, because the power is reserved. Let's say you live in Utah. Can Texas come in and tell you how to run your state? No, because that power is reserved to you as a state. And what we need to understand in this relationship of power being reserved, the federal government is just as much of a foreign power as France or Texas within your state. But if the power is not reserved, if your state does not have the right to say no, then you must accept certain consequences. These consequences cannot be denied if your states do not have the authority to say no to France, to Texas, or the federal government. That means if it's not reserved, it's open to anyone. If it's not reserved, then you must admit there is no limit to federal power, that the Constitution is actually a farce, and that the federal government can exercise whatever power it wants, and the states must simply comply. If the power is not reserved, and the states must simply do whatever the federal government tells them to do, then you must admit that the states are not sovereign. And if the states are not sovereign, they're like your 15-year-old. They can't make a legally binding contract, which means the Constitution itself is null and void, which means our federal government exists of its own authority with unlimited power, which means we do not live in a constitutional republic. We live in an absolute monarchy or an oligarchy with unlimited power to dictate to the people. But here's the good news. Our states are sovereign and independent. The Constitution is still a legally binding contract. And the federal government is still legally limited in its authority. And the only thing that has to change is this. Because we've been taught the wrong things for a long time. Studying this, understanding this, was kind of mind-blowing to me. 3 years of law school, nobody taught me this. Do you know that our law schools don't actually teach the Constitution anymore? What they teach is constitutional law, which tells us, lawyers and judges, and eventually the people, that judges and lawyers know more about the Constitution than the men who wrote it. That it's irrelevant because it was written so long ago, and it can't possibly have meaning today. See, the Constitution is not a statute book that says you can't drive faster than 75 on the interstate. It is a contract of timeless principles that create and define government, period, for a singular purpose. What is that? To secure our rights. Do you know what's ironic? The Constitution is a contract. Your pundits and think tanks and professors will call it the contract theory or the compact theory. Interesting, When the people who actually wrote it call it a compact, I don't know how you can call that a theory. The Constitution is the only contract in America where lawyers and judges refuse to apply contract law. You see, I had the honor to debate a law professor at the University of Miami. And the Federalist Society brought me in to talk about how to interpret the Constitution. Using contract law, there is only one way to apply the Constitution. This is not the opportunity for think tanks and judges and lawyers and Supreme Court justices to make it up as they go along. Contract law says you must first go back to something we call the meeting of the minds. The meeting of the minds is where the parties to the contract sat down and told us what the contract was supposed to do, how it's supposed to work. But this modern application of interpretation of the Constitution, brainwashing the people into believing that the Constitution is not a standard, that it has no meaning, and after all, it's a living, breathing document, is contrary to contract law. And so I brought this up at this debate because the law professor was trying to teach us how the Constitution has no meaning, it's written too long ago, the people are dead, we can't possibly know what they meant, which is another lie, by the way, because they wrote reams and reams and reams about what they meant. But you see, I asked a singular question. I said, okay, if the Constitution, which is a contract, is a living, breathing document, would it be okay for us to sit down with my colleague here, the law professor, and the dean of the law school, and go over her contract? See, what if the dean looked at the law professor and said, we realize what we meant when we sat down and created your employment contract, but after all, it's a living, breathing document. It doesn't really mean what we meant when we wrote it. It means what we want it to mean today. How do you think that law professor would like her employment contract to be viewed as a living, breathing document? Now, that was the point in the presentation where the dean of the law school went like this. But you see, we just simply have to apply some thought and some information and education that we've been denied. This is how it works. The states are inferior to the people. They are their creator. They are superior to the federal government in reserved powers. If we just simply taught that, things would be so different today. It's a check and balance on power that rests in the hands of the people.